Hi everyone, welcome to the May 26th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host Craig Belkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to be recapping some races from Santa Anita and Churchill Downs. This week we actually had some top horses in the country in action at both of those venues. There were a couple of Grade 1 races that were run at Santa Anita, those being on turf, the Shoemaker Mile and the Gamely Stakes. And at Churchill Downs, we had some pretty popular horses return in some minor stakes races. The Matt Winn, with Maxfield coming back, he was one of the top 2-year-olds of last year. And also Owendale and Dunbar Road returned to win some races for the older horses on the dirt. So we'll recap all of that along with some allowance and maid races that were pretty noteworthy last week. And we're going to get to all of it. Craig, how are you doing? And how did this 3-day weekend treat you?
It treated me about the same. I hardly even know what day it is anymore, given the state of things. So it wasn't really much different than a Wednesday, other than we had more racing. It was nice to see. I think we had 8 or 9 tracks on the menu on Saturday, so that was a pleasant change.
Yeah, for sure. It's great to have some of these major tracks running again. And this weekend, it felt like we actually had a lot of races to cover in terms of top horses that were in action. So I'm glad that we actually have a lot to recap this week, because it feels like we're sort of getting back into the swing of things with racing around the country. And we're going to kick things off at Santa Anita, actually just going back to yesterday's card, because we're recording this on Tuesday, and they ran some of those Grade 1 races on Monday this week, Memorial Day. And the big race was the Shoemaker Mile with a couple Chad Brown horses in the mix, River Boyne, who had come off a couple of stakes wins out there in California, stepping back up to the Grade 1 level. But it was the other Chad Brown horse, Raging Bull, who got the job done here. I think the story of this race, though, is just the supersonic early pace and just the perfect ride that Raging Bull got from Joel Rosario.
Yeah, he sure did. The figure didn't come back great for this race for Grade 1. Raging Bull ran a 122. But I'm not going to put a whole lot of stock in that, because there was a whole lot going on in this race trouble-wise. The pace was super fast, as you mentioned. It was a good race. I think it was nice to see Raging Bull get that Grade 1 win. He hadn't had one since back as a 3-year-old. Last year, somehow, for a horse as talented as him, he wasn't able to notch a win. But I do think he's going to be one of the stronger horses in the division. The runner-up Next Shares, I thought, ran great. He was one of the victim of War of Will's bad start at the beginning, where he basically took out two or three horses inside of him without parole, was bottled up back in third. So as definitive as the race looked, and I do think Raging Bull ran very well, there were some others to talk about in here, and I do think that given better trips, the figure for this race could have been higher than that lowly 122 for a Grade 1.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of the trips that were in behind him. I mean, I feel like Raging Bull was winning this race regardless. I mean, the margin at the end was 2 1/4 legs, and that's significant for a turf race going a mile. And I mean, Raging Bull, for a closer like him, to have just completely taken the race over by the time they reached the 8th pole, I mean, that just speaks to the fact that, he was really moving down the center of the track as they came into the stretch, and he won basically geared down at the end. Not saying that he would have won by more, could have won run faster. That's not what I'm suggesting. Just that the others who had trouble, did they have 2.5 lengths of trouble? I'm not really sure about that. And the horses you mentioned, Next Shares, I mean, yes, Next Shares got slammed at the start by War of Will, but I also kind of think Next Shares was going to be where he was in the early going regardless, because he is just a deep closing kind of horse that sometimes does lose contact with the fields in the early going of his races. Without Parole, though, I think is the horse you really have to discuss that might have been best in this race. I saw some people making the case for that. I thought that he was a little bit closer to the pace than I would have expected. He was actually basically just right in line behind War of Will, moving down the backstretch on the inside, about 6th or 7th place early. But he was only about 3 or 4 lengths from the lead. And given how fast they were moving up front, I think that was a bit closer than some people would have expected to see him. And Irad Ortiz, he tried to do the right thing by saving ground around both turns. And sometimes it works out for you, sometimes it doesn't. He just got unlucky in the stretch. He came out to search for room, had to alter course multiple times. He just ended up getting through too late, and you could see when he finally did find some daylight, this horse did have run left. Given how impressive Raging Bull was, I don't know if he would have won, but he definitely was the second best horse at the very least.
Yeah, I would say that. I think one thing I do remember us talking about last year was Raging Bull and thinking that a mile would be his best distance. He did get back to that towards the end of the year and ran well after they ran him longer, but I would think this year he's probably going to stick to that because it really seems to be right in his wheelhouse.
Yeah, I do think this is a race moving forward. While we're talking about all closers that rounded out the trifecta here, it would be a race where I'd want to give a second look to some horses that were close to the pace when they come back out of here. I mean, River Boyne actually ran really well, considering that he was probably much closer to the pace than I think most people would have assumed. He was just about a length or two off that pace down the backstretch. The same goes for War of Will, who I would have liked to see out in the clear in this race, but he ended up getting slotted in behind some horses early. And again, he was close to the pace, so I'd give both of them another shot moving forward.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. And I will mention the fractions are all coded in red. The pace figures early were in the high 140s, so it was definitely a hot pace. And I agree with you about River Boyne. I thought he actually ran pretty darn well given that outside post and being up close to the pace. And it is a race where I think you want to look at trips, but you also want to look at the pace. And you can probably find some bets coming out of this one that might be overlooked.
The other Grade 1 event on that Memorial Day card was the Gamely Stakes. It was the finale at Santa Anita yesterday for the fillies and mares, going a mile and an eighth on the turf. And while this was a Grade 1 race, it really had more of a Grade 2 feel to it, and maybe even weaker than that, especially when you consider that the Chad Brown horse that really everybody ended up betting in this race, Etoile, came over with some credentials from France. She just proved to be a total bust. She just was really never involved in the race at any point, didn't have much of a closing kick, so she was a non-factor, and you were really just left with those familiar faces that we've been seeing in California in these Grade 3 and Grade 2 races. And it was Keeper of the Stars who pulled off that big upset last time in the Buena Vista. She came right back at a mile and an eighth and did it again.
Yeah, she did, and you're totally right. This race got a 115, which is more Grade 2, maybe even Grade 3 type figure, but you know, it's a Grade 1 on paper, so that's what she's going to get credit for. We've talked about the California Turf Division being a little bit below the East Coast, or sometimes even a lot below, and I think that was the case here. And Etoile is a good point in that she was bet down so heavily. I think people were just looking for anybody that was a true Grade 1 mare or filly or mare to win, but she had nothing, as you said. She lagged back early, kind of made a little bit of a run, but never even reached contention. And I have no problem. I kind of did a double take when I saw what the figure came back, but the track was really consistent on the day. It fits with all the other horses that were tucked in behind. You had horses coming out of much weaker races to run well in a Grade 1. So I think that pretty much says it all about the status of this race. If these horses were to ship out and go somewhere else and face real Grade 1 competition, I wouldn't be very optimistic.
Yeah, Keeper of the Stars, she's a cool horse. It's nice that her connections have really figured her out recently. It seems like putting her out in the clear, not putting her behind horses, has really been the key to her success, because she's gotten that same kind of trip in her last two victories, and she's responded well. But I do think that if she steps up against legitimate Grade 1 horses, especially if Chad Brown sends his A string out to California at any point, because I'm not even sure the Beautiful Lover in Etoile would be considered his B string, she could be in trouble, because this was not a fast race, as you said. A race that did go pretty fast, as we saw earlier in the week on Saturday, was the Daytona for the older colts and geldings sprinting on the turf, going 5.5 furlongs. And we talked about this on the TimeformUS forecast last week, that this looked like a pretty competitive field, despite only drawing 7 runners. And it really turned out that way, as the favorites battled it out, but there was also a long shot in the mix that really mixed things up coming to the wire here. Wildman Jack did get up to win, but Sparkyville gave the entire field a scare.
Yeah, he did at 70-1, and he actually got the highest figure in the race, being part of setting that really fast pace early. The pace figure after the opening quarter mile was a 150 for the race, and he was up there fighting for the lead with Sistron, who was one of the favorites in here and wound up kind of backing out, albeit he did have a little bit of trouble. But I don't think there's much doubt Sparkyville was the better horse that day over him. And Wildman Jack, he ran well. I would say he took advantage of that hot early pace, but it's not like he was 5 lengths behind. I mean, he was just sitting a length or two off at most and was just able to wear the horses down late. And he kind of backed up that form he showed in Dubai. And, I think he's right up there with the best turf sprinters in the country, given these last 2 efforts we've seen from him.
Yeah, I mean, that last performance in Dubai, it's hard to know how to assess it because you're not really that familiar with the competition he was facing. It probably wasn't up to this level, but he did set a track record for the 6 furlongs in that performance and won by a large margin. So it's possible he's just turned a corner and he continued that momentum here. This is a really fast race. As for the others that finished behind him, we should mention that some horses did have trouble in the stretch of this race. Stubbins had to steady a little bit in Alter Course. Sistron got steadied out as well, though it seemed like Sistron was fading by that point already. I think there's an argument that maybe Stubbins could have won this race if Umberto Rispoli had ever been able to get him into the clear towards the top of the stretch. He just kind of had to alter course one too many times, and the stewards looked at this after the race, but I kind of agreed with them that the evidence was inconclusive, that you could have blamed it on either of the first 2 finishers.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I didn't have any problem with no DQ. It was a really tough one. Watching the replay 3 or 4 times, they kept showing it. I had no idea what I'd do, so I can't blame the stewards for not making a change here. But as opposed to the routers, I think we saw some really good sprinters here, and it's a strong division out west. I don't know, Stubbins has shipped more than some of the others, where the others stay mostly out west. So he might be a good barometer if he heads back east, but just a really strong race in my opinion.
And speaking of those Southern California turf routers, we saw them in action a little bit later in that Saturday card in the Charles Whittingham Stakes Grade 2 event going 1.25 miles on the turf. And it was United, the familiar face out in California who just seems to be around at the finish in all of these races. He got the job done here. United's never the kind of horse that's going to win by a large margin, but he just seems to have a nose for the wire or being right there at the end of his races. He got a little bit lucky here, though, because he held on in a head bob that really went his way. He got a pretty lucky bob there, but I guess he would have won the race anyway, even if he lost the bob, because the horse that he was in a photo finish with got disqualified.
Yeah, and he ran a 119 TimeformUS speed figure, the same thing he ran last time. He had run a 118 when he was beaten the time before that. So just a really solid horse. The one really big figure he ran came when he was second in the Breeders' Cup at those huge odds. But again, this was a grade 2 that's probably borderline for this figure. Rock Emperor, as you mentioned earlier on the Gamely, Chad Brown sent maybe his second string. I don't think you could put Rock Emperor any higher than his second string for the males. And he was right there in a nose bob with United. This another one. I don't really have any problem with the DQ. I do think he caused some problems. I could have seen this one going either way, so it's not one I would lose any sleep over the one way or the other. I mean, obviously, if you bet it that way, then you did, but it's a solid effort. Originaire did okay. He ran a 118. Didn't see a whole lot of trips in here. Maybe Desert Stone dropped a little bit too far back, but the pace wasn't all that hot, so just an okay race for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with the DQ is that it's inconsistency because, I mean, there was a little bit of bumping coming down the stretch, but speaking from the perspective of somebody who watches a ton of replays and watches a ton of head-on replays just as part of my day-to-day handicapping, you see what happened in the stretch of this race in a lot of races, and the stewards rarely take a look at that stuff. And I don't know if it's because this is a graded stakes race or just because one of them might have saw something this time that they decided to do something about it. But you'd like to see a bit more consistency with these calls. That's really all I have to say about it.
Yeah, the other thing, since we're talking about stewards, we didn't mention that War of Will was disqualified out of 5th in that race on Monday. And apparently that's a new thing in Southern California. They're going to start DQing horses at the start because that was 2 this weekend. And for a long time, we've never seen that out there. So it's kind of an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it's surprising to me, but people have different views on this. My perspective is I'd rather see the stewards get involved less because I just think it doesn't help the handicappers, and it's hard for a lot of people who are getting into the game to follow really what's going on here because it is confusing a lot of the time, and it's just not consistent. Well, hopefully they apply these same standards moving forward, but that hasn't been the case up until this point. The one other race we're going to discuss from this last weekend in California was the Monrovia. This was another 5.5 furlong turf sprint, this one for the fillies and mares. And Jolie Olympica, who had actually finished second to Keeper of the Stars, the Gamely winner in that Buena Vista that we just talked about a little bit, she turned back in distance here to the sprint distance, and she just proved a little better than this field. Mike Smith timed the ride perfectly. Alexandra came at her late, but she was just a little too far back early.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty impressive effort for her. She got a 122 Timeform US speed figure, which is her best in this country so far. It was one I'm a little leery of, and I'm going to go back and take a look at it again. But there was another 5.5 furlong race on the card. I went and timed them from video because of the disparity, just to be sure, and they both checked out just fine. So as of now, the figs look pretty legit. I thought all of the top four actually ran pretty good races. They all got 120 or higher Timeform US speed figures and a strong group of filly and mare sprinters.
Yeah, Jolie Olympica is a really nice horse. Alexandra was probably a little bit affected by getting steadied out at the start. I mean, she's a closer that was going to be last anyway, but you could even tell coming around the far turn. Joel had her a bit too far back than I think even he would have preferred because she had just too much ground to make up in the stretch. I still think Alexandra is one of the most exciting closers that we have in the game right now because when she gets into the clear in the stretch of one of these races, she's just a rocket ship. Sometimes there's just too much ground to be made up, though.
Yeah, since I'm curious what you think about Jolie Olympica stretching out again. They tried it last year, didn't work out as well, but I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot more money going a mile or in a mile and a 16th than there is going 5 and 5.5 furlongs. And it's not like she was disgraced when she tried a mile. She was narrowly beaten by a now grade 1 winner. So just curious what you think about her prospects.
I mean, frankly, I would give her another shot at it. I mean, I was way against her in that Buena Vista just because she figured to be so overbet, and she was, but it was really just a value thing. She actually ran fine in that race, and I mean, let's keep in mind, she was second off a layoff with just one 5.5 furlong turf sprint under her belt at that point, and it was a really easy victory for her that she had won her first start in North America. So maybe she just needed that first start going 2 turns, and I think she deserves another shot going that distance in the future.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page there.
Let's move on to Churchill Downs, where they ran plenty of stakes races this Saturday. We're going to also discuss plenty of allowance races and some maiden events that took place at other days in the week. But let's begin with that Saturday card. And I think the main attraction was the Matt Winn Stakes because it's offering now 50 Derby qualifying points to the winner heading towards that September Kentucky Derby. And I would imagine we're going to see the winner of this race in the Kentucky Derby field as long as everybody stays sound over the next few months because Maxfield was the big favorite here. He was a horse that had turned a lot of heads as a 2-year-old. While he hadn't run a particularly fast speed figure last year, I know he was one that was visually impressive in his races, and I think he did exactly what you would want to see him do in his 3-year-old debut.
Yeah, I agree. Before I get too much into that race, I do want to talk about a little bit in the Timeform US charts. It surprised me when I went to look at him this morning and I saw we have it coded in light blue as a track favor in closers. I'm not saying that's true or not because I haven't really looked that close. I do know most of the horses won from off the pace. But what surprised me is I have it coded in our the work that I do that if the track changes conditions during the card that I'm not going to give a bias reading. And I was really surprised that the track stayed fast throughout the day because they had a couple of downpours in there. So that's when I'm going to have to go back and reassess, look at it and just see if I think it's worth keeping it in there because clearly all those races were not run over the same track. I could see it when I did the speed figures. There's definitely some different variants being used. So it was just something I was really surprised that the track condition never changed. As for Maxfield in the Matt Winn, I don't think you could ask much more from him. He ran a 115 speed figure from us, which was a 9-point improvement over his 2-year-old best. So I think that's exactly what you want to see. It shows whatever his ailments were. I think he had a minor surgery that he's definitely over them. I doubt that he was fully cranked and ready to go for that race, and he looked really good. He wore down New York Traffic, who we pretty much know what he is at this point. He actually came in as the fastest horse, and I think he kind of legitimized his last couple efforts, and just a pretty good race. Pneumatic ran okay, I think. As I suspected, he's probably not a true Triple Crown race kind of contender, but he's a solid enough 3-year-old.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where maybe if this was Maxfield's final prep for the Kentucky Derby or whatever race he's pointing to, we could knock the speed figure a little bit because some of the other 3-year-olds have run faster up until this point. But I thought for what it was, this was what you wanted to see from Maxfield because, I mean, not only was it just a starting point, but also the pace of this race, it wasn't really fast. It was moderate. I mean, it wasn't a slow pace, but it was moderate, and the field was really bunched moving down the back stretch, and Jose Ortiz kind of had Maxfield in traffic for most of the race. Not that he had significant trouble, because he didn't, but he only basically got out into the clear at the quarter pole and had just about 2 furlongs to do any running at the end of the race, and he did what you would want to see him do. He was the only horse to close in this race. Nobody else did much passing at all, so I think he does deserve some extra credit for this victory, even though he got the same TimeformUS speed figure as New York Traffic, who was second. I think Maxfield ran the superior race.
Yeah, and I was also impressed with the way Paco Lopez definitely kind of steered New York Traffic out in the Max field, trying to intimidate him, I assume, and it didn't bother him at all. He just kept going, was really professional, and went right on by.
Yeah, with Paco Lopez on board the front runner, I think you just have to kind of assume that's going to happen in whatever race that you're in. Another stakes race that took place just before the Matt Winn on this Saturday card at Churchill Downs was the Blame for the older horses. This one was going the 1-turn mile, and we saw some horses from last year's Triple Crown series actually round out the exacta here. Owendale and Everfast, they were actually the 2nd and 3rd place finishers in last year's Preakness behind War of Will, and they were the top 2 finishers in this Blame Stakes. Owendale, to me, this is a good sign that he was able to get the victory here going a mile, because we talked about it on the forecast last week that maybe this was going to be a bit too short for him. Maybe there wasn't enough pace in this race. He overcame all of that and got it done.
Yeah, he did, and he was pretty far back early. I think he was actually last early, and it's not like the pace was supersonic. None of our fractions are coded in red. I would say it was just average at best, almost even moderate. So I think you really have to be impressed with Owendale. He got a 1:19 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which is what he ran 2nd last year. I think it was in the Clark in his last start behind Tom's d'Etat. And Everfast and Silverdust actually got a little bit better figures than he did. So really, for me, it was a fairly strong race. I do think Owendale has the most upside, given that he's proven he can run a little better going longer. But a good effort from those top 3. And even Mr. Money improved over his race first time out this year. Looked to be getting back into form, and I'd even expect better from him next time out.
Yeah, Owendale is a horse that I do think is just really a 2-turn type, so it'll be interesting to see him stretch out from here moving forward in his 4-year-old campaign, because he probably can go as far as 1.25 miles. He actually ran deceptively well in the Travers last year, so I'll be interested to see what he does when he gets to go longer distances. I felt like the performances of the other short prices in this race were a little disappointing. I mean, I guess you could give Mr. Money another excuse, but for me, he's had a few too many excuses at this point for his last 3 efforts where he's been off the board in all of them. I thought Mr. Money had a pretty good trip here. He was a bit wide on the turn, but he had a real shot at it at the top of the stretch and just didn't really quicken the way you would have wanted to see him do, or the way that he seemed to be able to do against lesser company last year. And the other big disappointment in this race was Global Campaign. I think it turned out that the inside draw just really did this horse in, because he wasn't quite quick enough to get forward coming out of the gate, and he was just sort of inside getting shuffled back for the entire race. Not that he had one single incident of severe trouble, but it was just sort of the cumulative everything adding up for him just never really being able to run through horses. It just didn't work out for him. So I think Global Campaign maybe deserves another shot moving forward. Mr. Money, I kind of have seen enough at this point. Moving on to the Shawnee for the fillies and mares. This one was actually going 2 turns, 1 mile and 1/16, a couple races before the Blame. And it really played out kind of as we figured that it would. Dunbar Road was the big favorite in this race, and she began her 4-year-old campaign in the right kind of style. She got the job done here. The pace was moderate to probably slow. They really just kind of walked through that opening quarter mile. And Dunbar Road was pretty far off the pace at that point, but she made a strong run around the far turn to get into contention, and she was just a little classier than these horses.
Yeah, she got a 118 TimeformUS for the win, and I thought the race was actually better than what the figure would indicate. It just said the pace was really slow, particularly early, then it picked up. But what caught my eye was the eye-catching move she made. It looked like when Jose Ortiz decided that he'd had enough, she just took him to the lead with, he did encourage her a little bit, but it's not like she was under a huge, all out drive to get there. And she just pretty much inhaled the field around the turn. She didn't finish it off. It's not like she was just pulling away Secretariat like down the stretch, but given the layoff, I don't think that's much of a concern. I was impressed by that big move, and the figure's solid, and I expect big things from her. She's certainly a grade 1 filly, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you mentioned the track earlier in the day, earlier in the podcast, about that light blue color-coded rating. When you see a performance like this, and also the fact that Vault closed into this slow pace, it makes you wonder, maybe, did horses coming from off the pace have a slight advantage? I mean, we'll talk about some other races on this card a little bit later that featured similar race flows. I kind of was on the fence. I thought it was maybe just circumstances that some horses that were much the best ended up coming from off the pace, namely Dunbar Road and Maxfield, but I could see the case that maybe the track was a little bit tilted towards the outside. That's fair. The one other horse that I do want to mention, because I don't have a whole lot to add about Dunbar Road, I thought this was a really solid return for her, and I'm interested to see what she does later in her 4-year-old campaign. I'm just kind of frustrated by the ride that Aw Emma got. I don't think Aw Emma was ever going to beat Dunbar Road in this race, but as we talked about on the forecast last week, this was a clear opportunity where there wasn't a whole lot of speed. She looked like the speed. She actually broke alertly this day, and for whatever reason, her connections decided to rate her.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. I don't think I would have taken any odds that she would be behind Chocolate Kisses earlier. I do think that one ran pretty well, I should mention, in her first dirt start since last summer. She made a big jump up as a 4-year-old, so I was actually impressed with Chocolate Kisses. I thought she ran pretty well. But yeah, the ride on Aw Emma is puzzling. Who knows if it's a trainer giving those instructions or the rider deciding it, but she's done all her best running on or near the front, and the change in tactics is questionable to say the least.
Yeah, I don't think she was going to win this race, but for those of us that bet a little exacta with Dunbar Road, I think we have a right to be frustrated about that one. There were a couple of turf stakes on Saturday for the 3-year-olds, one for the males, the other for the females. The one for the Colts and Geldings was the War Chant, which was actually the last race on this card. And this was one that was projected to feature a fast pace, and a couple of horses did go out wigging on the front end, but they sort of snuck away from the field around the far turn. And by the time they got to the top of the stretch, one of those speed horses, Smooth Like Straight, had just built up this insurmountable advantage, and some of them, his competitors, tried to close from the back of the pack, but they just couldn't make up that deficit.
Yeah, and the pace figures kind of tell the story. Even though they opened up that big gap on the field, it wasn't a particularly fast pace. Now, we can't really talk about times very much when we compared it to the Pepin run earlier on the card, because there was definitely a change in the track due to the rain that took place in between. So I couldn't really compare times between the two, and these races were basically rated in isolation. But that said, I don't have much doubt that the pace figures are fairly accurate for this race, and you can kind of tell by the result. The horses up close did fine. The horses who tried to make a run late just couldn't get there. And if I was going to bet this race coming back, I might want to look at the 2-3 finishers over the winner. And I will mention the winner got a very good 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, but I do think he had the best of it by far on the trips.
Yeah, I mean, the other speed we should mention, he was more of a long shot, and he really didn't finish anywhere of note. So Smooth Like Straight did put him away. It wasn't just like the race was dominated by frontrunners. I do think Smooth Like Straight might have been a horse that at least I feel like I underrated a little bit coming into this race, because he did run well within the context of some faster paces in Southern California, and he had that good win in the Cecil B. DeMille Mile last year. And like you said, the 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure that he got for this race, that's legitimate for the 3-year-olds. I mean, that's basically as fast as we saw a lot of the top 3-year-olds running into the summer last year when we were talking about that 2019 crop. So I think this is a good sign for Smooth Like Straight. And I don't think Smooth Like Straight wants to go much farther than a mile. That seems like his maximum distance, but up to a mile, he seems like a pretty talented horse. And Pixelate, like you said, and Field Pass even, they just had a bit too much to do, and I do think they're both nice horses, but they're two deep closers that are often at the mercy of the pace. The filly version of this race was the Pepin Stakes, which was the 8th race on this card. And sharing last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf winner came back here and got back to the winner's circle right away in her 3-year-old debut. Really, her and her main rival Alms took all the money in this race. Alms couldn't quite make that step up in class, but Sharing had no problem with it here. She got basically a 3-wide trip all the way around the track, and that really wasn't detrimental to her at all. And she just basically timed this perfectly to get up to win over the field.
Yeah, and I would say it wasn't detrimental to her chances of winning. I do think it had an effect on her speed figure. She only got a 103 from us. As I said, this was rated differently than the other stakes race, but there was other turf races on the card before that, at least one that I remember. So it wasn't a particularly fast race, but I was actually pretty impressed with the comeback. As you said, she was out 3 wide around the turn. She was in the clear without cover the whole way, and she actually kind of got forced by the rider on Alms. I forget who it is. It might have been Paco Lopez as well, who we talked about earlier, who kind of forced her hand and tried to make a move. She somehow wound up inside of Sharing from the far outside post, but kind of forced her into making an early move. And Sharing was able to keep that run going. She made a longer than ideal sustained run through the lane. So I think that did have an effect on the speed figure, and I'm not going to knock her too much for just running a 103.
Yeah, when they got to mid-stretch of this race, I was kind of waiting for Sharing to draw off by a length or two because it looked like she had that kind of run in her at the top of the stretch. She got a bit leg weary at the end, but as you said, I think the wide trip might have contributed to that. And also, it was her first start off a layoff, so we could be a little bit forgiving. There's not a whole lot that I have to say about the also-rans in this race. Maybe the one horse I would point out that ran well within the context of this race is the 3rd-place finisher, Past the Plate, just because we didn't see a whole lot of horses coming from the back of the pack in here. And she was one of the few that made a good run from towards the tail end of the field, but I thought Sharing was just the best horse in here. Moving on to some allowance races from this past week at Churchill Downs. We'll actually begin just yesterday on that Memorial Day card. Early in the day, going 6 furlongs, the 3-year-old filly Frank's Rocket beat some horses at the allowance level and did so quite impressively. We already know that she's a pretty fast and talented 3-year-old filly, and she just added to that reputation here with a big speed figure.
She did. She ran a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. Now, it was a race on paper. There wasn't a lot of speed. We had her shown on a very clear lead on the pace projector, which isn't always that common for a sprint race. But she was able, even though she was challenged a little bit, the first quarter was pretty slow. It was 109 on our pace figures. But from there, when she decided to go, Matt Garcia pumped on her a little bit, and she just pulled away through the stretch. So she was much the best. She's certainly a stakes caliber filly, and we're going to talk about Echo Town here in a minute, the 3-year-old who ran a little later on the card. She ran much faster than he did on final time. So just a good effort from her, and I expect her back in some sprint stakes next time out.
Now, I do want to ask you about these speed figures a little bit because you've got these 2 races at 6 furlongs, both allowance races for the 3-year-olds, Frank's Rocket and Echo Town, which we're going to talk about next. And there was a long weather delay at Churchill Downs yesterday where I don't think they got the rain that they were anticipating, but they did get a little bit of rain before Echo Town's race. There was a long delay between the 2 races, the one prior to that and Echo Town's race. Did you feel like the track changed at all? Because as we talk about Echo Town, he ran a slower final time, and given the field quality, you might have assumed he'd run fast or as fast or faster than Frank's Rocket. How did you feel about the track at Churchill yesterday?
It is actually one I have down the review. I do have a plan to do that today and just take a good look at it. It's always easier for me to look once the figures go through and I process them and they show up in our charts. And it just kind of really jumps out at you. And I do have some concerns that maybe the track changed. It's a pretty close call, and I didn't play it that way initially. Obviously, I did these pretty quickly because I wanted to get them done before our show today. But I will review it, and I'll certainly certainly post on Twitter if I do make any changes, because as you said, it is possible the track changed, particularly the first couple look a little bit faster, races 2 and 3 than the ones below it, but it's not a cut and dry situation where it's just obvious and clearly a change like I see on some other days.
Now, the one thing I will say about Echo Town, who did run a 113 TimeformUS speed figure, 6 points lower than Frank's Roquette, is that he's never the kind of horse that is going to win by a large margin. Echo Town just seems like the kind of horse that really likes to get into a fight. He did that with Long Weekend in that Bachelor Stakes at Oaklawn Park last time, where the two of them posted a really impressive speed figure going the 6 furlong distance. And in this race, it seemed like Ricardo Santana rode Echo Town like he was just looking for a challenge. I mean, they came to the top of the stretch and that horse Digital ranged up outside of him like he was going to take a really good shot at him in the late stages, but it seemed like Ricardo Santana had saved just a little bit for Echo Town to kick away again at the end.
Yeah, he's certainly a game horse, and this is a race which kind of goes to my point when I show it in the charts. Outside of Echo Town, who we have regressing off of that runner-up last time, you look at the figures for all the rest of the horses, and they kind of line up perfectly with what they've been running. So it really is a tough call. I agree with you on Echo Town. He's not a horse who's going to draw away and win by 6 lengths in a race like that. It looks like he likes a battle to the wire, and he was able to get out on top in this one. So I imagine he'll be back in stakes action pretty soon. Maybe even Belmont's opening soon. They have plenty of good 3-year-old sprints, so maybe you'll get to see him there.
Also on that Monday card at Churchill Downs, there was a turf race for the older horses. An allowance event won by Ramsey's Solution for Wesley Ward. This is a pretty intriguing horse. I believe he's a 4-year-old now, one that did not have a whole lot of turf experience coming into this race. I believe his one prior turf victory was just in a total bog, and he won that as a pretty uncompetitive race by about 6 lengths. He had run on synthetic since then and actually run against some pretty good horses. This was his first turf start in a long time, and it seemed like he definitely took to it.
Yeah, this was one I was kind of iffy on whether I wanted to talk about this one on the show, but he looks like a pretty intriguing horse. He's won his last 2 starts on the turf really easily. He had a nice win at Turfway over the synthetic, and in the other one, he was beaten by Some Like It Hot Brown, who's kind of a specialist on that Turfway Park. I think they still have Polytrack there. So, this is an intriguing horse. He's still lately raced as a 4-year-old. He got a 117 TimeformUS speed figure for this win. It wasn't a super fast pace, but it's not like he stole the race. The pace figures are just about the same as the final time figures. So he looks like an intriguing horse to me. It was kind of interesting he was able to clear to the lead from that far outside post without setting a fast pace. But once he did, the race was pretty much over because he showed some real talent the rest of the way.
Yeah, I was watching the Fox Sports coverage of this card yesterday at Churchill Downs, and there was some discussion after the race about how this horse could have made the front end. I know one of them referenced the TimeformUS pace projector and how this horse was all the way back in, I think, 7th or 8th on the pace projector. And it's just a situation, I think, where we're always going to have difficulty rating horses like this. Number one, because he was lightly raced, and number two, because his one prior turf race where he had been on the lead was just over that boggy course where I'm sure that the fractions aren't totally reliable. And even at Turfway Park, I think you coded in one of his recent races, there was a timing error. So I think it's just a horse that's difficult to make an early pace rating for.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, all of his last 3 races feature blue fractions at 1 or more points of call. There was a timing error too back at Turfway. The timer malfunctioned at the 3/4 mile mark, which is part of the pace projector. So, it's just something we tell people. The pace projector is more of a guideline. It should be a starting point for you. As we've both talked about, we don't always agree with the pace projector. It's an algorithm that is pretty effective, but it's not going to be right in every case. And this is a horse, when you look through his PPs, when you see all those blue fractions, but also that he's been up close, you know that he can probably go quicker if he needs to. He just never really has had to or been asked to.
Yeah, I like to say that the pace projector is a place for your conversation about pace to begin. And especially in turf routes, sometimes you want to look a little bit deeper than that because as we see in a lot of these turf routes, just because a horse goes to the front and the half mile goes in 50 seconds, that doesn't mean that the front runner can't run faster than 50 seconds to the half mile when he needs to. It just means that's how fast he's run in his prior races. So you might want to do a little bit more handicapping of the pace projector in some of these turf routes. Moving back to that Sunday card at Churchill Downs, we saw a maiden victory by the Chad Brown runner Per Capita. This is a horse who actually crossed the wire first in his previous start at Gulfstream and legitimately got DQ'd for that race, but came back here and he did it again. Got up for the victory, no DQ this time, and he actually earned a career best speed figure here, beating a pretty game established who was second.
Yeah, this was a pretty strong race, it turned out. Came back really fast on the clock. The figure is good, a 115 for the winner Per Capita, 114 for the runner-up in just his second career start. So it is one I'll be watching for sure. We had the always reliable Copper King back in third. So he is a pretty good guide since he runs similar races almost every time. I had pointed out on Twitter, he's a horse who has run in nothing but maiden races and actually passed the $100,000 mark in earnings on Sunday. So that's quite a feat that you don't often see. I mean, we see maidens go in stakes races and hit the board and boost up their earnings, but you don't often see it in horses just running in maiden races. So I'll be curious to see where Per Capita shows up next because he looks like a real runner here. And to mention, he was close to the pace. We do have all the fractions coded in blue, but he was still behind Established, the horse he eventually had to run down. So I would say he was the best horse, not just because he was the winner, but he was able to overcome that pace against the horse that he beat. And this has the looks of a really strong maiden race.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Per Capita, he's a 4-year-old, and he's obviously had some issues because it took a while to get him to the races the first time as a 3-year-old. Then he was off for a long time after a couple of starts last year. But if Chad Brown can keep this one sound, I agree with you that I think this is a horse that has some talent. He also has an awesome pedigree. He's by Tappet. That makes him a full brother to both Anchor Down and Iron Fist. Iron Fist was a millionaire. Anchor Down was a graded stakes winner going a mile. He's also a half brother to Sweet Lulu, who I believe won the test stakes. So his dam has been very productive, and there's definitely potential for this horse to do better when he moves up against winners.
And I should say, as much as I was going to say, as much as I pumped up that maiden race, I still would never bet Copper King again.
Yeah, I think it was a career best speed figure for him, but he just seems to find a way to get beat most of the time. Sticking with the Chad Brown runners, we saw another dirt victory by Chad Brown on Saturday in a maiden race as the 3-year-old filly Althoff, who had made one prior start on the turf, switched surfaces to the dirt here and looked like she should have been running on dirt all along because she just inhaled this field coming off the far turn and won off pretty impressively.
Yeah, this was a race I actually missed it live. I was out in the backyard cutting trees down, as my wife posted on Twitter, but I did get back in for the later races. But when I came in, I heard everybody talking how Chad Brown had an Oaks horse, and I was trying to figure out who it was. And then I watched the race, and it was pretty obvious who they were talking about. She got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which she'd still need to improve, but that's obviously possible given this was just her second start. This card, I will mention, it was a tough one for speed figures, not just because of the rain later in the card, but when I originally did these races, of course, I knew about the rain, but the first couple races on the day just came up fast. I always try to group together as many races as I possibly can to get the most accurate numbers, but I put them in the charts and I just wasn't happy with them, and I went back and reworked them, and it sure looked to me like the track changed after the second race. It was much faster early on, and because originally I had this race at only like a 103 or 104, I think it was. All the horses that ran were regressing, which is pretty rare for maiden, so I'm pretty happy when I went back and redid the card with the work. The figures look much better throughout the card, and this is one of them. I think that 109 is legit. Maybe the track played into it a little bit, particularly when you see the runner-up, a first-time starter, came from way back as well to get second, but it was a good effort from Altaf, and I imagine she's going to be in stakes races soon as well.
Yeah, I think you do have to discuss the way the track was playing on Friday and Saturday, because we're going to discuss a Friday race right after this. And I thought that the track was pretty inside speed biased on the Friday card. And once the day started on Saturday, it looked like the first three results were right along that trend, because the first race, I know that a horse that was wide won it, but he was a 2-5 shot that had to work pretty hard. And a horse that was 64-1 that rode the rail the entire way almost pulled off a pretty shocking upset there. And the next two races, I mean, they were both won towards the front end, or I should say the next race, the second race, was won on the front end by a horse that you wouldn't have expected to make the lead, but he ran away from that field riding the rail to victory the entire way. And as you say, the track got a little bit slower after that, and it seemed like suddenly closers had maybe even a slight advantage after that, and that continued on for the rest of the day. So I wonder if the track that Althoff was running over was a little different than what we saw in the first couple of races on the card, but take nothing away from her performance here, because she was impressive. She won by a large margin, and it's just going to be interesting to see what she does when she gets a real test against winners next time.
Yeah, totally agree. I think she's an exciting filly for sure.
And speaking of that Friday race that I just alluded to, there was an allowance race for the three-year-old fillies that was won by the Steve Asmussen charge, Casual. This was a filly who broke her maiden in her debut at Oaklawn Park last time. She is a daughter of Steve Asmussen's Grade 1 winner, Lady Tack, so the pedigree is obviously there for her to be a really nice one. I will say, though, that her trip just was absolutely perfect in this race, because not only was she up close to a pretty slow pace in the early going, but she was riding that rail that I really did think was an advantage on the Friday card. Things did not work out nearly as well for her main rival, Center Isle, who was the other one that took all the money in this race.
Yeah, they were definitely a tale of trips in this one. Casual certainly got the best of that. As you said, she was riding that rail, part of a slow pace. We have the half mile and the 5/8 coated in blue. And she wound up winning fairly easily in the end. She got a 107 TimeformUS speed figure, which was a point off of her race first time out when she won her debut. The final time was a 112. We knocked that back a little bit because of the pace, but a good effort. I'm not sure how much, how good this horse really is. I think I'd need to see more from her. I am curious what you think of Center Isle. Do you think we just put a complete line through that race, or do you think we learned something about her here?
I mean, I don't know if we learned anything about her, but she's definitely a horse that I'd want to give another shot to. I don't know what kind of spot she's going to show up in next. She could be a heavy favorite next time, depending on the competition that she's facing. But she is a kind of horse that, there was an 8-length gap from Casual back to Center Isle in this race. Center Isle finished 5th. And I don't think that there's an 8-length disparity in ability between Casual and Center Isle. I'm not necessarily knocking Casual, because she won this race and did it, she won by a length and a quarter, but it was the kind of victory where you thought, maybe if she got another challenge, she could have kicked on again, kind of like what we saw from her in her debut. She's a horse who really ran to get that victory. But Center Isle, I mean, she was steady coming out of the start. Some of it was her own doing, because she broke slowly. But from there, she was just out of position for the entire race. Not only that, but Joel Rosario had to take her wide around the far turn to try to make up some ground. That was not where you wanted to be on Friday. And really just nothing worked out for her. Hopefully it's a good learning experience and she moves forward off of this. That's not always a guarantee, but she's definitely a horse with more ability than she showed here. Let's finish things up on the Thursday card at Churchill Downs. We're just going to talk about a turf race from this day, an allowance event won by Mr. Dumas. He's a horse who was taking probably a needed drop in class because he had faced some tougher graded stakes horses in his 3 prior runs and was coming back to allowance company here. And he got the job done, though it was a race that was mostly dominated towards the front end.
It was. I just wanted to point this race out because he did get a nice TimeformUS speed figure of 122, a stakes quality number. Ritzy AP was in second with a 120, so it was a stronger than normal allowance race, I thought. But as you point out, it was a race dominated on the front end. Nobody really made up much ground at all in this field, so strong effort. I'm not sure I'd be ready to bet Mr. Dumas if he jumped right back in the stakes competition. He was beaten pretty handily a couple times in just weak grade 3s at Gulfstream, but I mean, this had to be an encouraging effort if you're the Connections, and it's certainly a step in the right direction for him.
Yeah, he's a nice horse, and he's in certainly the right barn of Mike Maker, who can get him back to that top level. But this was a graded stakes kind of speed figure, so it'll be interesting to see if he can translate that form into a tougher race. The one other horse I'd want to mention out of here, obviously, Front Run the Fed was a disappointment in this race. I didn't think he had a major excuse. But the one other horse that I want to mention is the number 4, Ivar. I'm not going to do a horses to watch segment this week, and even if I did, I couldn't show this race due to the restricted access to those Churchill Downs replays. But Ivar is a horse whose trip you might want to go back and watch because he was a little bit ranked the entire way, was just kind of wide and out of position for the entire race. It looked like Julien Leparoux was just kind of giving him a race in this country because this was his first start since coming up from South America. If you watch his South American races, this is clearly a horse with a lot of ability. Maybe a mile's too short for him. Maybe he needs to be more forwardly placed, but he's one that I would look for next time out.
I do want to mention one more thing about Mr. Dumas. It is interesting to note that it was his third start in the Mike Maker barn. He is a guy who doesn't necessarily improve horses right away when he gets them. He kind of does it, takes a little time with them, and that is part of why I wanted to talk about this. Maybe he is a horse that he's just figured out and is getting good at the right time, because as I mentioned, that is a stakes quality speed figure that he ran.
No, that's a good point. And also, he's a relatively newly turned 4-year-old, so these horses can always improve at this time, and Mike Maker is certainly the guy to do it on the turf. That's all the racing for this week. We'll be back later in this week on Friday to do some handicapping, as we've been doing for the past few weeks. We've got some big races on the horizon. The return to racing in New York is right around the corner, so definitely some exciting things coming up soon. Remember that you can always listen to both of these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with the TimeformUS forecast on Friday.